Me stand, please. I'll give you a chance to stand and stretch before we start here. We're going to have to turn all the lights off again, so please don't go to sleep on me, and I'll try to keep you where you can't help it, but stay awake. John chapter 1 and verse number 1, it says, "In the beginning was the Word." Notice a capital W, somebody. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. And then it says, all things were made by Him. And without Him was not anything made that was made. Let's pray together. You can be seated, and when you next open your eyes, the lights will be off, Lord willing. Let's pray. Father, we do thank you for letting us be here, and it's a blessing to have a church that's interested in Wednesday night Bible study, especially something a little out of the box like what we're doing right now. And I just pray that you'd bless us and help us now to see the touch of God on this time. I have no wisdom of my own. I just lean on you completely. Help me to speak clearly and to articulate properly, and give me the mind of Christ as I teach tonight. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Now, we're going to have to move quickly at times because I want to try to cover everything that I have for you. We just read this verse here. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. The same was in the beginning with God. All things were made by Him, and without Him was not anything made that was made. It says here, but from the beginning of creation, the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. So the Bible teaches here that God made man in the very beginning. God created Adam and Eve in the beginning, not 10 billion years after the beginning. Amen. 6 literal days, one of which He made Adam and Eve. Again, I believe the earth is literally 6,000, and the universe literally 6,000 years old. I believe about 4,000 years ago there was a worldwide flood, and Noah and his family were the only survivors, humanly speaking. And but how long ago was the beginning? God made Adam and Eve in the beginning. He created them. And by the way, the word created there, that God created, removes the possibility that Adam and Eve just evolved then. God created them. So how long ago was the beginning? A man named James Ussher. He lived back in the 17th century. He was the first that we know of to take the Bible and use all the ages and the genealogies to work backwards and determine how old the earth actually was. Now, back in those days, I guess nobody thought that the earth was billions of years old. However, he was the first to sort of try to document that with the scriptures, and he calculated that the earth was about 6,000 years old. And here is sort of what he did to add up these dates and the overlapping dates. It's a little bit complicated, but it can be done with someone who has the time and the appetite for it. Here's the creation timeline. We see about what does that say? I can't read my own writing there. About 6,000 years ago, God created everything. About 4,400 years ago, there was a flood. And then Jesus came, and here we are today. So about 6,000 years ago of history. That is the creationist timeline. That is the Bible timeline, while the dates and years are not given. Again, that's roughly what we believe. I wouldn't greatly fall out with someone that differed a little bit on 1,000 or 2 years. However, best we can figure, that's about 6,000 years of history of man and of the earth and of the universe. Now that sort of boggles the mind in our day because we're so ingrained to think of everything being so old, because that's what we hear about everywhere we go, the millions and billions of years. Now I've referenced Francis Crick a few times in a positive way, but certainly this is not one of them. He's honest, and he's this way he's honest, but he's just wrong. If someone tells me that the earth is less than 10,000 years old, in my opinion, he should see a psychiatrist. Now, that is basically the opinion of many evolutionary scientists about people like you and I. There's another quote from him that says, basically, only you fundamental Christians believe the earth is less than 10,000 years old and you're a bunch of idiots. Now here is what is called the Tree of Life, an animated version. Darwin had this Tree of Life, another version of it in his book, The Origin of the Species. And it shows that, life evolved from very simple life and worked its way around through natural selection, and boom, here is man over about a 3.5 billion year period. Evolution depends on the ancient ages, on what is called geologic ages or deep time. In other words, they believe that over the millions and billions of years, evolution occurred and had to have that long to occur. This one says, to understand evolution, humans must think in much larger units of time than those we use to define our lives. After all, evolutionary change isn't apparent in days, months, or years. Instead, it's documented in layers and layers of rock deposited over 4.6 billion years, which is what they believe is the age of the earth. So evolution mandates, if you will, deep time. Here's an educational science website that says, it's instructing the teacher. An important requirement for natural selection to produce the great diversity of life we find on Earth is a substantial amount of time. What they're saying is that if someone destroys the belief in the ancient times, in other words, the millions of years or billions of years, they destroy evolution in the process, because evolution must have that type of deep time in their minds to have happened. Then this website goes on to say, and this gives you an idea of the bias sometimes that exists towards us. He says, unfortunately, there are many people who are convinced, based on an analysis of certain religious writings, that the earth is only 6,000 to 10,000 years old. He says, unfortunately, that's the case. In other words, the idea is, well, you can believe the Bible or you can believe science, but you can't believe both. Well, that certainly is not the case. That's a false choice. And so then it basically says here that everybody believes, all scientific evidence suggests that the earth is 4.5 billion years old. Well, it certainly does not. And we're going to talk about that in great detail tonight. This one basically says, I'm going to hurry along, that for a species to change from one to another and to keep that change would take about at least 1 million years by their way of looking at it. So for one animal to slowly change into another animal, any substantial difference, they believe it would take at least 1 million years. I'm not going to read all that. I'll just move along here. Here's an article that's interesting. I saw this actually today and added this in. This Evolution News and Science Today is talking about these folks that did some work on algorithms and determined that even at 4.6 billion years, there had not been enough time for evolution to provide all the diversity of life that we see around us today. So basically, that's a precursor to asking for more time. Now, what they're realizing is, slowly but surely, even if it happened, which it certainly did not, but they are realizing no matter how much time you create, it's not enough time for it to have happened. Now, the evolutionist believes, again, that the universe is 13.7 billion with a B years old, having begun with the Big Bang, and that somewhere around 4.6 billion years ago, the Earth developed in a crude form, and then about 3.5 billion years ago, the first living thing evolved from non-living matter on the Earth. Now, we talked about how they have no explanation for how that happened, but they just state it. They say 3.8 billion years ago is our best guess for the beginning of life on the Earth, New Scientist magazine. So, what I'm going to present to you tonight, first of all, I just want to let you know that it is absolutely mandatory by the evolutionist way of thinking that we have billions of years. Because he knows, she knows, if we don't have billions of years, their theory dies. So again, if we can destroy the idea of billions of years, we inherently destroy any thought of evolution being true. Here's the oldest tree on the earth. It is it's believed to be about 5,000 years old. It is the Great Basin bristlecone pine, lives in California, in the White Mountains. Now, the same article that this particular tree was found in, this picture, also says that trees have been around for millions of years. So the question is, if trees have been around for millions of years, why is it that the oldest tree is only 5,000? Now, the date of 5,000 years works just fine if you believe in creation in a 6,000-year-old earth. It doesn't work at all if you're an evolutionist and believe that trees have been around for millions of years. The Sahara Desert is the largest desert on the earth. It is also the oldest hot desert. There's the region where it covers. Now, the Sahara has a prevailing wind, which means it blows primarily in one direction. So that is how the desert grows, because the wind blows the process mainly in one direction. It is estimated that the Sahara Desert increases each year about 5 miles. It says here, the Sahara, the world's biggest hot desert, is getting even bigger. In fact, is currently about 10% larger than it was nearly a century ago. All right, now think with me just a moment. If the Sahara Desert is getting bigger every year, that means last year it was smaller than it is this year, right? So the further back in time you get, the smaller it would be. Correct? So if you go back based on this rate of about 10% per year, here's where it would have been some time ago. It was smaller. There's the current line. There's the old, so many years ago. But since the Sahara is growing each year, it would be smaller in the past. Based on the growth rate, the Sahara Desert has to start thousands of years ago, not millions. In other words, if you take the 10% growth rate and run it backwards, the Sahara would have had to begun about 4,500 years ago, not millions of years ago or billions of years ago. So if the Sahara is millions of years old, why is it not much, much larger? And if the earth is billions of years old, why is the largest desert in the world only about 4,500 years old? Now, that's no problem for us who believe the Bible. It's very consistent with what we'd expect to find, because we had a flood. So the desert wouldn't begin maybe until after the flood. So, and the curse and so on. But interesting. Now, this is not absolute proof, but it is consistent with the Bible model. It is not consistent with the evolutionary model. See, not everything can prove something. There's an evolutionary model, and it would predict certain things. Our model would predict certain things. So the question is, what do we find in the real world? Do we find something that is consistent with the evolutionary model, or do we find things that are consistent with the Bible model? So far, we've seen these things are consistent with the Bible model and give the other guys a really hard time. The Great Barrier Reef is the world's largest coral reef. It's off the coast of Australia, around Queensland. It can be seen from space. It's so large. It is basically half the size of the state of Texas. Now, this outfit is a big marine research center in Australia. They did an extensive study of the reef and determined it had to be less than 4,000 years old. So, by the way, it is by far the largest. So if the earth is billions of years old, why then is the largest barrier reef in the world less than 4,000 years old? See, this again is very consistent with the Bible model, not at all consistent with the creationist or the evolutionist model. I love this one. This is a picture of the inside of the National Ice Corporation lab in Lakewood, Colorado, and they store ice cores for research. You've probably seen this before. They believe that layers in ice cores like this one correspond to years and seasons, with the youngest ice at the top and the oldest ice at the bottom of the core. So what they say is that you have these rings that appear, and that's winter, summer, winter, summer, winter, summer, winter, summer. So you'd have basically 2 rings per every year, in theory. And they use this to predict the ages of what they drill into down below. So they believe that the deeper you go, you can bring up a core like this and count the rings, and for every 2 rings you have a year. Now, here's photos of how they do that, and then bringing up cores. Again, they claim that the ice cores provide evidence that the Earth cannot be young, because they have all these hundreds of rings, each of which, or thousands of rings, I should say, each of which is half a year long, or a winter, or a summer. This article in Science Magazine claims this ice core to be dated at 2.7 million years old. Shattered the record, it said, at 2.7 million years. That's from counting the rings on this deep ice core that they drilled out. They count the dark rings in the ice cores, believing them to represent years and so on. They liken the rings to be like the annual rings of a tree, which, by the way, neither are tree rings absolutely, infallible. Because of the weather, they can change also. Now, I'm going to show you, I hope, a little video in just a moment. Researchers tell us that the layers represent annual rings because in summer the top layer of snow melts and then refreezes as clear ice, which shows up as dark here. In the winter, the snow packs and shows up as white, also as shown here. So you have darker and lighter, and again, they believe that these are winter, summer, so you get 2 rings a year. Now, this ice core was reported to be 491,000 years old from Antarctica. Now, here's the video. Oh, hang on now. I don't have sound. How do I get sound, John? I'm sorry? I'm sorry, what's what plugged into? Huh? Well, it's plugged into my Apple and the wall. So I'm not sure how you got sound before. I guess that's my question. I hear it very faintly.
Down in this valley of the Cumberland Gap, where Kentucky, Virginia, and Tennessee converge, a World War II fighter plane is being restored to flying condition. For 50 years, this P-38 Lightning was buried in an icy grave until it was finally rescued by a team of adventurers. The plane was dug out of the ice, 268 feet below the surface of Greenland, where it crash-landed in 1942, while on its way to fight Hitler's Germany. The recovery expedition was financed and captained by Roy Schaffner, a former Air Force fighter pilot who fell in love with a chapter of forgotten history. In Schaffner's hangar in Middlesboro, Kentucky, the plane is being rebuilt by hand, piece by piece.
People walk in here in a small town of 9,000 population and see a project of the enormity that we've taken on, the history that we're preserving, and then they'll come up and say, well, why is it here? Why is it in Middlesboro, Kentucky? And I have to say, well, because I'm here.
Schaffner has nicknamed his plane Glacier Girl. It was one of 6 fighters and 2 bombers that disappeared while en route to Europe. The squadron flew into a thick fog, ran out of fuel, and was forced to land on the glacier. The pilots and navigators were rescued, but their planes were left behind. P-38 pilot Brad McManus was the first to crash land on the ice cap.
Come right on in. Thanks.
Wow,
Isn't that something?
I can't believe it.
Oh,
I
yeah.
just can't believe it, boy.
It doesn't look like a crush.
More than a half-century later, McManus is the first squadron veteran to see the rebirth of a plane abandoned a lifetime ago.
It's the original engine in there, huh?
Some old
How about that?
part we put.
The final chapter of this historical journey is yet to be written. It is Schaffner's goal and McManus's dream to see the plane fly again over Greenland and on to England, retracing the original mission of the Lost Squadron.
That little P-38 is going to roll out of that hangar and take off. It's going to be a big day.
All right, now I shared that with you, and I'll give you some more detail. This set of planes had to crash land above the Arctic Circle in Greenland during World War II. The plane sat there for 50 years. This man wanted to go get one. By the way, he spent $7 million to go get this plane. When he got there, they used radar to find out where it was at. And they saw that it was deep, 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 deeply under the ice. In fact, about 280 feet under solid ice in just 50 years. Now understand what I just said. These planes, in 48 years, were buried under, this is 263, you get different numbers. Biggest one I had is 280. Let's just go with this for now, because it's up there. 263 feet, not inches, but feet of ice had piled on top. By the way, these planes did not sink into the ice. They were covered in that much ice and snow in 48 years. So what they did was they had these giant heating drills, and they bored a gigantic hole 265 feet down in the ice, basically melting it and pumping out the water. Here's a guy going down in one of these holes. You see the ice rings? Bob Carden is his name. He says there were many hundreds of layers, ice rings, above the planes when they dug them out. I mean, look at all of them. Now, here's the thing, before I go to this slide. The set of planes, they actually found a couple of them, again, 263 feet below the surface, been buried in that much ice in just 48 years. There were enough rings counted above those planes that by the secular scientist point of view, this plane would have been 2,500 years old. And we know for an absolute certainty they've been down there 48 years. Now, the Greenland Ice Core Project was a similar type thing. They drilled very, very deeply, and they drilled a 3,000-meter ice core in the bed of Greenland. The ice core measured 100,000 years of time, but that's assuming each ice ring represents a year. A reevaluation using the idea of freezing and thawing, and here's what they say, here's what the creationist guy says. These are not winter, summer, these are freezing, thawing. And just like here, it freezes one day, thaws the next. Freezes one day, thaws the next. I mean, it happens many times during the season, not just one time. So during one season, 1 year, you'd have many, 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 many rings formed. Using that calculation, then it was about 2,000 years worth of depth, which again is very consistent with the Bible model, not at all consistent with the evolutionary model. Bottom line is, dating techniques based on ice cores is 100% unreliable. Here are some stalactites and stalagmites. We have been to a place called the Forbidden Caverns up near Sevierville. Who's ever been to a cavern and seen these things? All right, I don't know what they told you when you were there, but they usually tell you do not touch them. Because even just, if you just touch one, it might cost them 100 years worth of accumulation. Because they teach and believe that these things form over many tens of thousands of years. They claim that usually about 10 centimeters for 1,000 years. And by radiometric dating, they believe that most of these things, or some of these things, show to be about 200,000 years old. And you'll still read in textbooks that these things form brutally slowly, and that one of any length at all would be tens of thousands of years old. But we have some problems with that. For example, here's the Lincoln Memorial, built in 1922, and a photo of stalactites several feet long in the 1960s. Now, I'm not good at math, but I don't think between 1922 and 1960 is very long. Again, they would say that for 10 centimeters to form would take 1,000 years. Didn't happen that way there. Nor here. George Rogers Clark Memorial in Evans, Indiana. They had a problem downstairs. They had a leak that was 75 years old, where water had been dripping down in the basement for 75 years, and it formed this stalagmite and stalactite. One goes up, one goes down, this one joined. Now, here's some scale. It's rather large. Happened in 75 years, not 7,500 years. Now, this is not theoretical. You can go look at that one. Same thing here. In an old lead mine in Australia, you see long flow stones. Notice the signs here that say switch for the miners to use. It was closed for 55 years. When they came back, they found these. Had grown in that period of time, only 55 years. Let me tell you how quickly a flow stone can form. Do you know what's underneath? And you've probably seen this, some of you, so don't blurt it out. But this is a picture of a bat. Found in 1953 in a stalagmite in Carlsbad Caverns in New Mexico. The stalagmite grew around the bat so quickly it didn't have time to decay or to be eaten. Now, if you had a dead bat, how long does it take something like that to deteriorate? Rather quickly, right? And so it happened so fast that this bat was covered and is encased in a stalagmite. So, don't kid us and tell us that these things take thousands of years to form when we see things like this that say, no, that happened in a few years. In fact, it happened much quicker than that. Here's a thing I think is neat called the Tempe Fountain. Now, that is a ginormous flow stone in Wyoming. And people come from everywhere to see this thing. It started in 1903 when someone drove an iron pipe into the ground. And mineral-rich underground water began to flow out top of that pipe and form a flow stone. From 1903, it happened really quick, and look how ginormous, as they say, it is. That did not take 1,000 years, and it's a tad more than 10 centimeters. It's a giant. It happened in about this picture I think is about 20 years old, or the data is about 20 years old. The picture's much older than that. But that happened in just, a few years, so to speak. So don't tell us that stalagmites and stalactites are thousands of years old when we see stuff like this. They can happen very, very quickly. Now, did you know that evolutionary scientists estimate that modern man evolved between 100,000 and 200,000 years ago? So that before, now get this before I move on, what they're saying is, to say before 200,000 years ago, there was no intelligent man. By their way of looking at it, there might have been some ape men, some crude men, some men like they would call the Neanderthals, which we know they used tools and played music and worshiped God. We understand that. We find the artifacts that prove that. So they would say that 200,000 years ago, modern man came to be. So he's smart enough to do things. But if that's true then, Why is it that human artifacts, nice ones, have been found inside coal and other sedimentary rocks like sandstone and limestone, which are said to be millions or even billions of years old? Now, let me just mention this real quickly. You have igneous rocks that are formed from molten material. You have sedimentary rocks, which are formed from sediments, sedimentary, that are in water, and they settle to the bottom and later dry out and become stone. Basically, it's like dried out mud that becomes very, very hardened. That's what sedimentary rock is. You basically only find fossils in sedimentary rock because something is dead, it's covered up by the mud becomes hard, and it leaves the impression or sometimes the literal flesh and bones of that animal inside that sedimentary rock. Are you with me on that? All right, so now if anything is found inside sedimentary rock, that had to form there. It had to exist before the rock was formed. Now, there's all kind of stuff that is found inside a sedimentary rock that looks a whole lot like somebody made it. For example, these are called the groove spheres of South Africa. Now, you look at that. Now, this is a hardened material. It's a weird material. I mean, I don't know what you think. I would say it's highly unlikely that that happened naturally. But coal miners have been finding these things for years, and they're finding them in rocks dated 2.8 million years old. So here you have an object that may have been man-made in a rock that they say is almost 3 million years ago, which would have been 2.5 or 6 million years before there was a man to make it, according to their thinking. You follow me? Now, they measure about an inch or so in diameter. Some of them have these etchings and so on, the parallel. I mean, this is not something that I don't think nature would do this. Now, here's a little doll. In 1887, a guy named Kurtz found, he was going to have a water company. They began to drill in Nampa, Idaho. And about 300 feet down in 1889, this doll came up in the rubble. It is a stone doll. You see the size of it. At 300 feet deep within sedimentary rock. At that level of depth, 300 feet, the stone this doll was found in would be dated for at least a few million or possibly even billions of years old. Apparently they did not actually date the rock, but that's consistent with what they believe about rocks of that depth. So here you have obviously a man-made item enveloped in rock that's millions of years old. That's a pretty good clue that somebody made that little doll, and that little doll got buried in the rock when it was formed by sediment. Do you have an idea that maybe that's a pre-flood doll? Here's some other pictures of it. Here are human footprints of sandals found in 1968 in Antelope Springs, Utah. There is a human sandal print, and it was found in Cambrian Wheeler Shale. That's a sedimentary rock. And it measures 10 1/4 inches long. It's pointed at the toe and rounded. It's obviously someone's shoe print, sandal print. And there is a trilobite, a squash trilobite, in the center of the shoe right here. Now, trilobite is believed to be one of the most simple forms of life that ever existed. And some scientists would suggest that man never lived at the same time as trilobites. But here's a guy who squished one with his foot. Now, he was probably walking in some mud. Later on, it got covered and became stone, and there's your fossil. So the Utah Geological Survey examined the fossil and found no irregularities or evidence of fakery. In other words, they determined it was genuine. There's a little bit bigger picture and so on. The rock it was found in was said to be over 600 million years old. I think we have a problem with their dating techniques. If you've got a shoe imprint in 600 million year old rock, according to them, there's something wrong with the way they're measuring time and dating rocks. That would be, you know, a whole lot longer than man should have been around to make that footprint. That's a pre-flood track in the mud. Here's an iron pot that was found in coal. Coal is a form of sedimentary rock, and by the way, does not take millions of years to make coal. You'll make it rather quickly. Fell out of this pot in 1912. The coal was dated to be 300 million years old. Here's another picture of that pot. And by the way, that's the letter attesting how it was found and so on right there on the right. Here is what is called the Dorchester pot, found in the debris of sedimentary rock being blasted at a depth of 15 feet. Now, some people call this a bell, but the pot was kind of injured. They kind of put it back together there to make a picture, but the blast tore it apart. But it was found in the rubble that came out of that hole at a great depth. The Scientific American, which is not exactly a Bible college or a Bible publication, reported on this find in 1852 in June the 5th edition. Also discussed in other books. So how does something like that, I mean, look at the design of that. Look at the artwork of that. How does that get inside of coal that is supposed to be rock between 570 and 593 million years ago? And there's a paragraph from the Scientific American article that it was reported in. Well, the only way that could happen is because that rock is not that old, and that's a pre-flood pot. It was buried in Noah's flood. Here's a bell that was in 1944 found by a young man named Newton Anderson who dropped a lump of coal on his basement floor and it broke in half and this bell fell out. The coal that it was found in is supposed to be 300 million years old. There's some more pictures of it. And by the way, it was found to have a very strange combination of metals, alloy, that we don't use anymore in modern history that we know of. No one's ever used this alloy. Now, you watch the History Channel, they say, see there, that's proof of aliens. And I'm not kidding you. They will attribute all these type of things to aliens. I dare you to watch it. You've seen that Ancient Alien show? It's full of stuff like this. The aliens brought those bells here. The aliens brought that pot here. Well, I think if an alien is smart enough to come here, he'd have a better bell than that. Here is a handprint in a fossil, or in stone rather, and the stone was dated 110 million years old. Now, if that's not a handprint, I'll quit eating fried chicken. Here's a hammer that was found encased in 450 million year old stone, they say, near London, Texas. So you've got all these modern artifacts, man-made artifacts, encased in rock that they say is millions of years old. Well, that lets you know one thing, their date is wrong. And number two, it seems to indicate there was a flood, everybody died, and all their stuff was buried. And that's what all this stuff is. 66% of the planet is covered in sedimentary rock. There was a big worldwide flood and buried all this stuff in it. Now, let's talk about radiometric dating for just a moment. Now I'm gonna try not to get in the weeds here, but I have to explain how it works for you to understand the point I'm trying to make. Radiometric dating, and this is the one that they say, well, see there, we've dated these rocks, that's science, gotcha. Well, hang on just a minute. Radiometric dating is a process of identifying the age of material based on the known half-lives of decaying radioactive materials found in them. Now, I'll explain this in just a moment. It is often used to determine the age of rocks, bones, and ancient artifacts. Things which were once alive or are carbon-based items can be tested with carbon dating techniques. So you've got what they call a radioactive, like potassium argon, rudium, and then you've got the carbon dating, carbon-14 dating, for things that were either alive or had carbon in them, like diamonds, stuff like that, and coal. Now, I'll explain a little more about how this works. let's just say, for example, in a rock, potassium-40 will degrade into argon gas. So you have a rock, the rock is made. The rock has potassium-40, that's an element, a radioactive element. It will, over time, become argon gas. So the rock will have less potassium and more argon as time goes on. Does that make sense? So since they know how long it takes for that to happen, it takes 1.3 billion years for half of that potassium to turn to argon. So there you have a clock of sorts, where you can say, okay, in 1.3 billion years, half of that will turn to argon gas. So they use the ratio of potassium to argon in a stone to measure how long it's been since the rock was formed. Does that make sense? So if half the potassium-40 has changed into argon gas, the rock is allegedly 1.3 billion years old. Now that's straightforward, isn't it? And it seems perfectly logical, and how could they be wrong? Well, there's some problems in what really happens when they do testing with these things. For example, here's an article out of Nature magazine. It says, Isokron dating of Zaire cubic diamonds. They're dating diamonds which contain carbon. And their age was measured to be 6 billion plus or minus a few 100,000 years old. Does anybody see a problem with that date? All right, well, somebody tell me. What's the problem with that date of 6 billion years ago? I'm talking about from their point of view. Bingo. How old do they believe the Earth is? 4.6 billion years. And yet they're saying that diamond tested to be 6 billion years. So what they're saying is that the date of the Earth, that the Earth is younger than the diamond. You understand what that means? They believe that, they don't believe this, but I'm saying that's their date. That this diamond is older than the Earth. Where do diamonds come from? They come from the Earth. You can't have a diamond without the Earth. And yet their testing technique gives a date 1.4 billion years older than the Earth, which makes diamonds. I suppose the diamonds were floating in space for 1.4 billion years. Or maybe the aliens had the diamonds on their ship and they just came by and dropped them off. Here is a rock flow, a lava flow, that people watched come out of a volcano in Hawaii. The eruption lasted for about a year between 1800 and 1801. So these rocks are approximately 200 years old. All right? They tested these rocks using several radiological methods. Of the 12 dates reported, the youngest was 140 million years. The oldest was almost 3 billion years. For rock that they saw come out of the volcano 200 years before. I think there might be a problem with their dating technique. Oh, by the way, and this is they failed to mention this in the textbook. They say we know the age of rocks, we've dated them, and it's a perfect method. They failed to mention this. Here is a great volcano in New Zealand that erupted in 1954. It spit out about 280 cubic feet of lava. Samples were taken, dating was done, and the dates were as high as 3.5 million years. And the stone was 52 years old. I don't know. I'm not the smartest guy in the world, but if radiometric dating is not accurate for rocks we know the age of, why should we accept any dates determined by this technique? Mount St. Helens, May 18th, 1980, it went kapow. Lava went everywhere. It cooled off. It turned to stone. This guy, who's a PhD in geology, Pennsylvania State University, took samples. He sent the samples off to a lab. The ages came back that these stones that were made in 1980 were anywhere from 350 to 2.8 million years old. And when he did it, the rock was only 10 years old. I'm kind of thinking they have a problem with their technique. I mean, they missed it just a little bit. Now, another thing is this. Carbon-14 in diamonds is evidence of a young Earth. It's a popular belief that carbon dating is used to date things that are millions of years old. That is absolutely false. Carbon dating cannot be used to date anything older than 100,000 years. That's because of the very short life of carbon-14, which is about 5,700 years. Well, they measured it a little and extrapolated. But if something were older than 100,000 years old, it would not have any detectable amount of carbon in it. Does that make sense? Because the half-life of carbon is so low that if anything has carbon in it, it has to be less than 100,000 years old. That doesn't mean it is 100,000 years. Okay, you understand what I'm trying to say. It doesn't mean we accept that that's reality, but it can be no more than that. Now, all the carbon-14 would have decayed by then. And if the carbon rate decays have been consistent, any carbon-14 found would be undetectable after 100,000 years. And I say that because they believe it takes millions of years for diamonds to form. Now, by the way, we know that's not true because they make diamonds in a laboratory now in about a week. I'm talking about gem quality diamonds, not the kind you use on a saw. They make them so good now you cannot tell the difference between a natural diamond and a man-made diamond under the best of microscopes. You can't tell them apart. And they make them in about a week. Now, if carbon-14 is found in something, it has to be less than 100,000 years old. I mean, that's by their way of thinking it. We don't buy the 100,000 years, but the math would say it could be no more than 100,000. You see what I'm trying to say? Because a lot of these things are up to dates. It's not like a clock on the wall or a calendar on your wall. Did you know that carbon-14 has been detected inside natural diamonds? This is evidence that diamonds are only a few thousand years old at the most. Not millions or billions of years like you've been led to believe. And I didn't have time to include all the photos I have of them making diamonds in about a week, but it's all over the internet. You can find it for yourself if you're that curious. Sedimentary rocks are formed from sediments in water settling and hardening into rock. You see the layers? These layers are called stratum. Plural is strata. Now, the evolutionist guy looked at this and says, okay, now, here's a layer. This layer was laid first. Well, duh, that takes a lot of brain power to figure that out. This one was laid first, and then it got really hard, and it lasted millions of years, and then another event happened, and we got this layer, and it got hard, and there's millions of years, and so on up. So they say down here is probably several million or maybe 500 million years old, and up here is less than that, but it's all old and all ancient now. Here is the Grand Canyon. You see all the layers that have been formed. How quickly do layers of strata form? This man's name is Charles Officer. He's a research professor at Dartmouth. He wrote a book, The Great Dinosaur Extinction. He said you get 1 centimeter per 1,000 years. And that's where they say, oh, and this is a typical idea, that if you have a layer that thick, it's got to be millions of years old. No way around it. But well, there's a problem for them. And the problem is called a polystrate fossil. The word polystrate means many strata. There are places where tree trunks have become fossilized while extending through several layers of strata, several layers of rock. They are called polystrate fossils. Here's a drawing of some. And so what you have here, all these layers of stone, which the evolutionists would say have been laid down over millions of years, one layer at a time. But yet you've got trees in the upright position who pierce many layers, poly, many, strata, straight, many layers of soil in the beginning and now rock. Now, how does a tree stand up and wait 1,000,000 years for more rock to be formed without rotting? We have trees back here that have gone, they're dead. After a year or two, they're in pretty bad shape. How long do you think a tree would last? And by the way, without roots. Most of these have no root form. Now, how do you get a tree without roots? And how do you get a tree without limbs? It happens in a flood. It happens in a geologic event like a lava flow. We'll have a picture if we have time of Mount St. Helens. All those trees came down the mountain and they look like telephone poles. They don't have roots, they don't have branches, they're like big telephone poles, and there's about 20,000 of them in Spirit Lake. And by the way, they look just like this, and they're being covered by sediment just like this. So what does that suggest? It suggests that these layers formed before the trees could rot. In fact, it does more than suggest it. It couldn't happen any other way, that these layers were laid down rapidly, not slowly over hundreds of thousands of years. I've got some pictures. It's a 30-foot petrified tree. It's one of thousands, or hundreds rather, found in Kettle Cook Mines near Cookeville, Tennessee. And the top and bottom are in different coal seams. Now again, they would tell you that coal takes millions of years to form. All right, so if that's the case, how do you get a tree in two different layers of coal that just happen to wait millions of years for the next layer to be formed so it could stand up within it? It can't happen. Same thing here. There's a tree in rock going through several layers of stone, which evolutionists would say that's many thousands of years right there. And that tree somehow just stood there for 5 or 10 or 20,000 years and waited to be encased by rock. Couldn't happen. Mount St. Helens, 1980, before and after. Here's Spirit Lake after the eruption, covered with trees, a mat of trees. Here are those trees sinking down in the water. Here's a sketch of what's going on underwater. They've observed this, where layers of sediment are being laid down, burying those trees in the upright position. It's happening very quickly, not over 10,000 years. There's a thing called diatomaceous earth. They're made of little things called diatoms, which are very, very small. They are made of silica. Their walls are made of silica, glass. And they die in the water, and they pile up at the bottom of the sea, or wherever they are, mainly a sea, I think, not the ocean, or not a lake. And they make fossils, and they make deep piles of this stuff that's called diatomaceous rock, but because it's so soft, they call it, sometimes they'll call it earth, okay? Diatomaceous earth. You can buy it at Home Depot, I believe, has this. People use it for all kind of stuff, for gardening and whatever. Now, guess what they found in a big pile of diatomaceous earth? They found a whale. Now, they couldn't take a picture of it, but they drew a picture of it. An 80-foot long, it was actually a Balian whale, was found in the upright position in a diatomaceous earth mine in 1976. So how does a whale survive 10,000 years while he's being covered? I mean, they would suggest that the diatomaceous earth formed a little bit and then grew and grew and grew over many tens of thousands of years, and somehow that whale stood there and waited on it. It just didn't happen. By the way, they forgot to put that in the textbook. This is called a short period comet. In space, you've got short period comets and long period comets. Halley's Comet is a long period comet. It comes around once every 75 years. Don't know how old it is, but short period comets, they revolve around the sun in a 200-year or less cycle. Short period comets pose a real problem for those who believe the solar system is billions of years old. Why? Because they are made of ice, primarily made of ice. And their orbit takes them close to the sun. Last time I checked, the sun was hot, mighty hot, and it would certainly melt ice. And this is known to be a fact that these comets melt over time. Because every time they go around the mountain, so to speak, they come around the sun, they melt a little, they lose a little of their volume. A little of the ice melts away. And they only last a short time because they eventually melt away. Now, each time a comet orbits close to the sun, it loses so much material that it could not survive for millions of years. The scientists tell us, those who are honest, that a short period comet can last no more than 10,000 years. If the universe was billions of years old, there would be no short period comets. They would have all melted long ago. Now, but the evolutionists has an answer. By the way, there are what are called rescue devices. In other words, they're magical stories that they make up to rescue their theory. And one of them is called the Oort cloud. Oort cloud. Now, the Oort cloud, boys and girls, is a comet factory. And that's where all the short-time comets are made. And so that's why, boys and girls, we don't run out of comets, even though they melt, because the Oort cloud is so good. It just keeps on making them. Now, there's a problem with that. And here's an article about the Oort cloud and so on. There have been so many articles written about the Oort cloud. There have been many thesis documents, theses written on the Oort cloud. A lot of books about the Oort cloud. And here's from SpaceAnswers.com. What do we know about the Oort cloud? Well, we know it extends up to a light year from the sun. We know it's where comet Hale-Bopp was born. We know it is made of trillions of icy bodies. We know it's extremely poisonous. We know it might be home for an undetected star. We also know it was once part of the inner solar system. Now, all this is coming from Space Answers now. It would take the latest spacecraft 30 years to get there. We know that 2 dwarf planet objects have been discovered there. It defines the border of the solar system, and it might not actually exist. I mean, I didn't write that in there. That's what they have. Now, I have a question for you. If you're not sure it exists, how can you know any of that? They have never seen it. They have never found it, but yet they know so much about it. Now think about this. That is how gullible they think we are. I mean, if I was them, I'd at least leave the last one off. So, it is a total fabrication. Now, here's why they believe in that, because by their way of looking at it, it has to be true. In other words, the way they think is, well, let's see now, short-run comets melt after about 10,000 years. We know that's true. We can't deny that. So why are we not out of them? Oh, there has to be a place where the comets are made. So because it has to be, to make my theory true, that means it is. Because there has to be a comet factory somewhere, or else my billions of years is not true. Therefore, there has to be a comet factory, and so we're going to write a bunch of papers about it, write a bunch of books about it, say all these things are true of it, but it might not really be. But we think it is, you see. That is called science, falsely so-called. Not science. That's faith, and in a bad object. Here's another one. There are several kinds of galaxies in the universe. There are spiral galaxies, that, like ours, the Milky Way. Elliptical galaxies look like this, and irregulars look like this. NASA identifies these 3 kinds. Now, notice this one, which is the Milky Way and others like it, many others, in fact, is sort of like a pinwheel, isn't it? Well, it's actually turning. And it's turning in such a way that these wings are getting closer together over time. Now, the presence of spiral galaxies is a problem if you believe in an old universe. See, they look sort of like a pinwheel. And one of the biggest challenges to the evolutionists is these lovely spiral arms that they have as it winds around. Simply put, these spirals would lose their shape in a very old universe. In other words, if the universe is 15 billion with a B years old, and these spiral galaxies have been turning all that time, they would have turned so far inward they would no longer have the wings or the arms. Does that make sense? And so they would just look like a blob in space. So it's really, and by the way, they hate this. They hope you'll never mention this because they have no answer for it. Not even a suggestion of an answer that I know of. You know what? Stars die. Stars have been dying at the rate of about once every 30 years. And when they die, they explode and they make a nova, or if they're really big, a supernova. Now, at that rate, there should be, and I apologize, it's kind of hard to see, at this rate of 1 every 30 years, there should be millions, countless millions of dead stars if the universe is 15 to 20 billion with a B years old. I mean, do the math. If a star dies every 30 years and the universe is 15 to 20 billion years old, there would be countless numbers of dead stars in the universe. Does that make sense? But there are not. Only 300 have been found. That's pretty strong evidence we have a young universe and that it's less than 10,000 years old. It's a big problem for them, consistent with what we believe. The Earth has a magnetic field. It's getting weaker. At the present rate of decay, the magnetic field of the Earth will be gone in 2,000 years, making life on Earth impossible. So you better hurry up and get right with God. You only got 2,000 years. If we could rewind the magnetic field, life on Earth would have been impossible due to its strength about 10,000 years ago. So on the one hand, it's not going to last very much longer. On the other hand, if it's more than 10,000 years old, all life on Earth would have died because of its strength. By the way, other planets have them too. And if they were millions and millions of years old, no planet should have a magnetic field. All of them would have gone away by now. Here's the one I know you want me to get to, and it's, God, I don't really have that much time. But the speed of light. In fact, I can't start this. It's too long to start. I apologize. I got the plane one done. I advertised it Sunday night. This one I have ready, but it's just going to take too long. And then the moon one also is behind this one. But I'll tell you what, I'll give you those two next Wednesday night, okay? Because it's almost 8:30. I'm sure our workers are going crazy up there, okay? All right, so let's get the lights and let's stand. I love this one. I love it, and I'll just give you the question in a nutshell is, since distant stars are sometimes as much as 300 billion light years away, and that's the distance that light travels in 1 year is a light year, since they're that far away, how could we see them if the Earth is only 6,000 years old? Because it would theoretically take 300 million years for them to get the light to get here, right? If it's 300 light years away, it would take 300 million, it'd take 300 million years for that light to get here, but yet we do see them. So how do we explain that in light of the Bible teaching that the Earth is only 6,000 and the universe only 6,000 years old? I'll explain it to you next Wednesday night. I apologize. I heard it as quick as I could, but I couldn't quite get to it. And then we'll talk about the moon and what the moon shows us about the young Earth also. And then the following, after that, we'll probably get into more biological evolutionary ideas about proofs that cannot be either, that one life form slowly changed into another. It didn't happen. It can't happen. It's impossible to happen. We'll talk more about that next Wednesday night. All right? Hope you're still enjoying this. And so let's pray together, and we'll see you outside. And Andrew, please pray for us.